Welcome back to English podcast session. I'm John.
And I'm Amelia. Today, we're diving into a topic that affects so many of us: perfectionism. The idea that we need to be flawless at all times.
Perfectionism is something we've all encountered either in ourselves or in others. It can drive us to achieve great things, but it can also hold us back and cause unnecessary stress. So, today's question is, when is perfectionism helpful, and when is it harmful?
Let's start by defining what perfectionism really is. It's a personality trait where someone sets very high standards for themselves and strives to meet them, sometimes to an extreme.
Exactly. And it's not all bad. For example, perfectionism can motivate people to work hard, aim high, and achieve excellence. But there's a fine line between being driven and being overly critical of yourself.
Right. And often, perfectionism comes from a deeper place sometimes. It's rooted in childhood or from societal pressure. We'll get into that shortly, but first, John, how would you describe your relationship with perfectionism?
Oh, good question. I think I've always had a bit of a perfectionist streak. I want everything to be just right. But I've learned over the years that chasing perfection can sometimes stop me from even starting something. What about you?
Same here. I've definitely struggled with it, especially in my career. I remember rewriting a project presentation over and over again, just to make it perfect. In the end, it was good, but was the extra stress really worth it?
That's a great example. Sometimes, perfectionism pushes us into analysis paralysis, spending so much time fine-tuning that we never finish.
And that's when perfectionism becomes harmful. It can lead to procrastination, burnout, and even mental health issues like anxiety and depression.
To better understand this, let's break it down. First, let's look at when perfectionism is helpful. Amelia, what do you think?
Well, it's helpful when it drives us to improve. Think about athletes, artists, or scientists. Their pursuit of excellence often comes from setting high standards. That's a healthy form of perfectionism.
True. Like when a student studies hard because they want to do their best on an exam, not because they're afraid of failure, but because they genuinely value the effort.
Exactly. And perfectionism can also help with attention to detail. Think about surgeons or engineers. Their work needs to be precise.
But on the flip side, perfectionism can become harmful when it's tied to our self-worth. For example, when we think, if I'm not perfect, I'm a failure.
Yes, or when it stops us from taking risks because we're afraid of making mistakes. That fear can keep us from growing or trying new things.
And that's when perfectionism becomes destructive. So, how do we find balance? How can we keep the positive aspects of perfectionism without letting it control us?
Great question. I think one key is self-awareness. Recognizing when our perfectionism is helpful and when it's not. For example, asking yourself, am I being productive, or am I just stuck in a loop of overthinking?
Another way is to focus on progress, not perfection. It's better to aim for good enough than to let the fear of imperfection stop you.
Absolutely. And let's not forget self-compassion. It's okay to make mistakes. In fact, mistakes are how we learn.
Before we go further, let's take a quick vocabulary break. If you're learning English, this is a great time to expand your vocabulary related to today's topic. Welcome to our vocabulary section. Let's go over some important words and phrases related to perfectionism.
First up, strive. It means to try very hard to achieve something. For example, she strives for excellence in everything she does.
Next, self-worth. This refers to how you value yourself. Example, his self-worth shouldn't depend on his work performance.
Another one, burnout. This is a state of physical and emotional exhaustion caused by overwork. For instance, he experienced burnout after months of working long hours.
Analysis paralysis. A phrase that describes overthinking to the point where you can't make a decision. Example, she faced analysis paralysis when choosing a university.
And finally, self-compassion. Being kind to yourself, especially when you make mistakes. Example, practicing self-compassion can help reduce stress.
Practice using these words in sentences to make them part of your vocabulary. Now, back to our main discussion. Thanks, Amelia. That was a helpful break. Now, let's talk about how to approach perfectionism in a healthy way. One tip is to set realistic goals.
Yes, like breaking down big tasks into smaller, manageable steps. That makes goals feel achievable instead of overwhelming.
Another tip is to celebrate progress, even small wins. Perfectionists often focus on what they didn't do, instead of recognizing what they did accomplish.
And remember, feedback is your friend. Instead of fearing criticism, see it as an opportunity to grow.
That's so important. Nobody's perfect, and perfection isn't the goal. Growth is.
Speaking of growth, let's end today's episode with a short story that highlights this idea.
There once was a potter named Sarah who loved making pottery. She spent hours on each vase, making sure every curve was perfect. But no matter how hard she tried, she always found a tiny flaw. One day, Sarah's mentor told her, "Perfection is an illusion. True beauty lies in the imperfections." Inspired, Sarah created a vase with a deliberate crack running through it. She filled the crack with gold paint, transforming it into a unique masterpiece. That's when Sarah realized, imperfections tell a story. They make us human. And sometimes, what we see as flaws are actually what makes something or someone truly special.
What a great reminder! Progress over perfection. And that's a wrap for today's episode of English Podcast Session.
We hope you found this discussion helpful. Remember, you don't need to be perfect to be amazing. Thanks for listening.
Subscribe and don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. See you next time!